Anti-Semitism has a long history and many different reasons. Some Christians see Jews as responsible for the death of Christ. But the fact that Jews were usually minorities in the countries they lived in meant that they had little political power, which made them great scapegoats in times of crisis. Even before the Holocaust, there were countless pogroms in Europe. So in the late 19th century, a movement began for the Jewish people to find a place they could call home and where no one would persecute them anymore. This was the beginning of Zionism. A bunch of influential Jews formed the World Zionist Organization and came up with options for a possible homeland, and the lucky winner was Israel, the land that they believed had been promised to them by God, and from where they had been expelled by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago. There was just one slight problem. There were already people living there, the Palestinians. While some Zionists wished for Arabs and Jews to live side by side in harmony, the majority believed that Jews would never be safe unless they had a state with a majority Jewish population. Unfortunately, European Zionists, just like many Europeans at the time, were also very racist. In a time in which Europe was committing unspeakable atrocities across the world, the needs of a few 100,000 Arabs were of little concern to them. Chaim Weizmann, president of the Zionist organization, would later say, "The British told us that there are some 100,000 Negroes in Palestine, and for those there is no value." Interestingly, then, just like today, many of the most fervent Zionists were not Jewish. Many Christians have been supporting the Zionist movement since its inception, believing that a Jewish return to their historical homeland would cause the return of Christ, and all faithful would go to heaven, while all non-believers, including the Jews, would go to hell to suffer for eternity. It seems odd, but in the US today, the largest base of support for Israel is not American Jews, but evangelical Christians. Anyways, it was decided that Palestine would become Israel. But how could this be achieved? The strategy was simple. In Palestine, most of the land was owned by wealthy individuals living abroad. For centuries, Palestinians lived and worked on land that did not belong to them. When the landowner decided to sell, the Palestinians living there would continue to do so. But the Jewish National Fund, which became the agency through which the Zionists purchased land for Jews to settle, ensured that Jews would evict the Palestinians from their newly purchased land, even if they didn't plan to live on it. The Jewish National Fund also began a secondary mission to carefully document each village, gather information on their defenses, layout, and inhabitants. This information would be vital in the conflict ahead. When World War I broke out, the British looked for ways to gain support and influence from the Arabs. During the Hussein McMahon correspondence, they promised independence to the Arabs in exchange for their help against the Ottomans. But the British also realized the importance of control over the Middle East and saw in Zionism an opportunity to create a European forward base in a strategic location. One of the founders of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, said it himself: "The Jewish state would form a part of a wall of defense for Europe in Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism." With this in mind, Lord Balfour, former British Prime Minister, made an official declaration in which he promised to establish in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people, understanding that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, don't get confused. Balfour's support for Zionism was not because of his love for the Jewish people. In 1905, while many Jews escaped Russia to flee the pogroms by the brutal Tsar, Lord Balfour, as Prime Minister, presided over the passage of an act that put firm restrictions on immigration into Great Britain. Balfour wrote in 1919, the Zionist movement would mitigate the acerbic miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or to absorb. Balfour did not make his declaration to give the Jews a place to go. It was about giving them a place to leave. Another problem was that he only mentioned the native Arabs as non-Jewish communities, and only guaranteed their religious and civil liberties, not their political rights. The needs of the Arabs were of no concern to him, as he had a mild case of being insanely racist. He was recorded saying, "We have to face the fact Men are not born equal. The white and black races are not born with equal capacities. They are born with different capacities which education cannot and will not change. Despite all this, the Balfour Declaration was incredible news for the Zionists. It meant that Great Britain, one of the largest superpowers in the world, would officially support them. But the Balfour Declaration might as well have been a war declaration for the native Palestinians, who began to realize that the Jewish state would be created at their expense. With help from the British, Chaim Weizmann established the first Zionist office in Jerusalem in August 1918. A Jewish newspaper wrote a few years later, "The Jews must purify their homeland, Palestine, of those who have usurped it. The Muslim inhabitants of Palestine must go to the Hijaz and the desert, and its Christian inhabitants must move to Lebanon." In February 1920, the British military governor of Palestine confirmed in a public statement that the British would try to establish a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, which led to large protests and violent clashes between the local population and Jewish settlers, even leading to the death of a Jewish soldier. During the Feast of the Prophet Moses, Arabs celebrating felt threatened by Jewish settlers nearby who they believed were being challenging. This escalated, leading to more violent clashes both in Jerusalem and Jaffa, in which 5 Jews and 4 Arabs died, with hundreds more injured. Realizing that the local Palestinians were beginning to resist their colonial project, the Zionists founded a paramilitary organization called Haganah. Apart from the riots, Palestinians also resisted through peaceful means. They formed congresses comprised of both Muslims and Christians and sent letters to the British, the Paris Peace Conference, and even the League of Nations advocating for their self-determination. In 1920, the League of Nations created the British Mandate for Palestine, officially putting it under their control. The mandate document included the Balfour Declaration in its preamble, almost word for word, and strongly encouraged Jewish immigration by giving them Palestinian nationality. It also essentially allowed for the creation of an administration parallel to the British mandatory government, with the power to veto laws passed by Palestinian councils, ensuring they could never have any real political power. As Jewish immigration began increasing, many more Palestinians were removed from their lands. In the Yishuv, the Jewish name for the settlement in Palestine, Jewish immigrants were told to hire only Jews and buy from Jewish-owned stores only. This led to the formation of the first Palestinian political organizations. With the Great Depression of the 1930s hitting Jewish and Arab workers alike, economic tensions between the communities began to grow. The Haganah also grew more and more. A pro-Nazi Arab nationalist group, known as the Black Hand, began terrorizing Jews and destroying Jewish-owned properties. In response, the Haganah also began committing terrorism against Palestinians. But while the British authorities cracked down hard on the Black Hand, they allowed the Haganah to carry on. The pressure led the British to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine. But while it curbed the inflow of Jewish immigrants, tensions only grew. Many Jews and Zionists were enraged at this, having hoped to flee the rising anti-Semitism in Europe, which would soon culminate in the Holocaust. However, this limitation on immigration only added to the persecution of Jews in Europe. Feeling betrayed by the British, Zionist Jews formed the Irgun, a group that began committing terrorist attacks against both Palestinians and British targets. Many prominent members of the Irgun came from the Beitar Youth Organization. One of them was a man called Avraham Stern, who in 1940 would break off to form the Stern Gang, which committed acts of terrorism against the British and had the stated aim of the conquest of Palestine by Jewish immigrants. They sought to do this by collaborating with Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, seeing their policy of removing Jews from Europe as an opportunity for more immigration. Tensions between Jews, Palestinians, and the British reached a climax in 1936, when a general strike paralyzed the economy of the British Mandate for half a year. The revolt then led to a rebellion and a guerrilla war against British colonial rule. The British responded with brutal force, killing thousands of Palestinians. The British Army demolished entire villages, executed anyone they thought was a rebel, and with the help of Jewish militias like the Haganah, crushed the Palestinian resistance. With much of the Palestinian leadership arrested or killed, their opposition to Jewish settlement was dealt a heavy blow. The British realized, however, that peace in the area could only be kept if both sides came to an agreement and issued a white paper, which stated that Palestine should become an independent state within 10 years. The white paper greatly upset the Zionists, leading them to increase their collaboration with the Nazis against the British and the Palestinians. With the onset of World War II, British authorities tried to balance the desire for Arab cooperation against Nazi Germany, while ensuring that the Jews had enough autonomy to become a reliable ally. The Haganah cooperated with the British Army to form a Jewish brigade to fight in the war, while the Irgun and Stern Gang kept sabotaging the British authorities. World War II would see the Jewish people become the target of an unspeakable genocide. And while it seems odd to suggest that people who survived the Holocaust could be racist, the Jewish hatred towards Arabs became intense. It became an issue of survival. If the Jewish people wanted to continue to exist, they needed their own state. If the Arabs were to stand in the way of that, they would be destroyed. After World War II, the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust began to try to emigrate to Palestine. Many came through boats and secret operations to evade British naval patrols. In August 1945, the British continued to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine, causing the Zionists to increase their resistance. The British began interning Jewish refugees and forcibly returning them to Europe, even imprisoning Holocaust survivors. These measures, combined with the growing tension and terrorism against both Jews and British personnel, led the United States to pressure the British government to allow more Jewish immigration to Palestine. The situation in Palestine reached a boiling point in 1946 when the Irgun bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which housed the British administrative headquarters. This attack killed 91 people, most of them civilians, and wounded 46 others. In retaliation, the British launched Operation Agatha, arresting thousands of Jews and uncovering large caches of arms and documents that implicated the Jewish Agency in terrorist activities. The British even detained members of the Jewish Agency Executive, the de facto government of the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine. The British soon realized that their mandate over Palestine had become untenable. Faced with increasing violence and unable to find a compromise, they decided to hand the issue over to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan which would divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan, even though it meant giving up claims to the entirety of Palestine. The Arab leadership, however, rejected the plan as it gave a significant portion of the land to the Jewish minority. This rejection led to the outbreak of the 1947-1948 civil war in Mandatory Palestine, with violent clashes between Jewish and Arab communities. Jewish paramilitary groups like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi began a campaign to secure the territory allocated to the Jewish state and expand its borders. This included the controversial Plan Dalet, which called for the conquest and expulsion of Arab villages. The most infamous episode of this campaign was the massacre at Deir Yassin, where over 100 Arab villages, including women and children, were killed by Irgun and Lehi fighters. This and other atrocities led to a mass exodus of Palestinian Arabs who fled in fear of their lives. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The following day, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded the newly declared state, marking the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Israeli forces, bolstered by weapons and volunteers from abroad, managed to secure victory and even expand their territory beyond the UN partition plan. By the end of the war, Israel controlled 78% of what had been Mandatory Palestine, and more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees, unable to return to their homes. This event, known as the Nakba catastrophe by Palestinians, remains one of the core issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The newly formed state of Israel was now a reality, but it was born in blood and suffering, with deep wounds on both sides that have yet to heal. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians would continue to define the region for decades to come, with countless lives lost and generations growing up in a state of perpetual conflict. The dream of a peaceful coexistence in the land of Israel and Palestine remains elusive, as both sides struggle to find a way to share a land that holds deep historical, religious, and cultural significance for both peoples.